Margaret Johnson, 90, sold her Georgia home and sent all the money to her son in Chicago, believing she would finally be able to live near her family. Instead, her son abandoned her at the airport to collect the insurance money. Homeless and forgotten, she lived on leftovers until she was arrested for stealing discounted bread that she never actually took. In court, her quiet truth exposed betrayal, racism, and the neglect of the elderly. The city rallied to help. Her son repented. She regained her dignity and her home. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe in karma, this story is for you. The late afternoon sun hung low over the small town of Savannah County, Georgia. The air was warm but gentle, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming lavender. Cicadas hummed lazily from the trees, and a slow southern breeze brushed against the weathered wooden porches that lined the quiet street. It was the kind of town where time did not rush, where mornings began with coffee on the steps and evenings ended in silence. Margaret Johnson was 90 years old. She was a slender black woman, slightly stooped with age but still carrying herself with quiet dignity. Her deep brown skin bore the soft lines of a life fully lived. Creases at the corners of her eyes from decades of smiling, faint folds around her mouth from years of prayer and patience. Her silver-gray hair was always pulled into a neat low bun at the nape of her neck. Her hands were thin, veined, and careful in their movements. When she walked, she leaned lightly on a polished wooden cane that had once belonged to her late husband. Margaret had a calm presence. She rarely raised her voice. Years of hardship, growing up in segregation-era Georgia, losing friends to injustice, watching her husband battle illness, had shaped her into someone who believed endurance was strength. Pain did not make her bitter. It made her quieter. She lived alone in a small wooden house with peeling white paint and a front porch wrapped in climbing lavender vines. The house was modest but proud. Inside, the floors creaked gently with every step. A faded floral couch sat beneath a framed black and white wedding photograph. A small wooden table near the window held her old radio, its antenna slightly bent but still faithful. That radio was her companion during long evenings. Margaret's husband, Samuel Johnson, had built the porch himself nearly 50 years ago. Samuel had been tall and broad-shouldered, with a rich mahogany complexion and a steady, reassuring voice. He worked as a mechanic in town and believed in fixing what was broken rather than replacing it, whether engines or relationships. His death 10 years earlier had left a silence that never fully disappeared. Their only child, David Johnson, had grown up within those walls. David was now 52 years old. He had inherited his father's height, but not his father's patience. Tall and well-groomed, with short, neatly trimmed black hair now graying slightly at the temples, David had sharp cheekbones and alert brown eyes that constantly seemed to calculate something unseen. He dressed carefully. Tailored jackets, polished shoes, expensive watches. In Chicago, he worked in real estate development, a competitive field that rewarded ambition and punished hesitation. As a boy, David had been sensitive and eager to impress. But leaving Georgia for Chicago had changed him. The city hardened him. Competition sharpened his instincts. Success became proof that he had escaped the limits of his upbringing. Margaret rarely complained about how little he called. She would sit by the window in the evenings, watching the sun lower itself behind the trees, the radio murmuring softly beside her. Sometimes she would glance at the phone resting on the small table, hoping it might ring. It often did not. In Chicago, far from the warmth of Georgia, the wind cut sharply between skyscrapers. The city skyline glittered at night like a promise that never slept. David lived in a modern high-rise apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. Linda Johnson, his wife, stood often at those floor-to-ceiling windows. Linda was 48 years old. She was tall and slender, with fair skin and carefully styled chestnut-brown hair that fell just past her shoulders in controlled waves. Her posture was always straight, her movements precise. Her eyes, cool gray-green, missed little. She had grown up in a middle-class suburban household where financial stability was treated as sacred. Her father's bankruptcy during her teenage years had left a lasting mark. She feared instability more than she feared loneliness. Linda was not cruel by nature. She was pragmatic, practical. Numbers made her feel safe. Recently, numbers had not been kind. A real estate development David invested heavily in had failed. Permits were delayed, investors withdrew, and construction halted halfway through. The losses were significant. Bills accumulated quietly behind polished countertops and designer furniture. One evening, as Chicago rain streaked against the glass windows, Linda sat at the kitchen island reviewing financial statements. "We need to think strategically," she said, her voice calm but firm. David rubbed his forehead. "What do you mean?" Linda hesitated only a moment. "If your mother moved here, she'd qualify as your dependent. There are tax benefits, insurance adjustments, Social Security supplements. It wouldn't solve everything, but it would help." David did not respond immediately. He looked toward the dark skyline. "She's alone down there," Linda added softly. "Isn't it time she came here anyway?" The suggestion lingered in the air. Back in Georgia, Margaret was watering the lavender when the phone finally rang. She moved slowly but eagerly, her heart lifting before she even picked up. "Hello?" "Mom." David's voice sounded warmer than it had in years. She smiled instantly, her tired eyes brightening. "David, baby, are you all right?" "I've been thinking," he said. "You shouldn't be alone anymore. Sell the house. Come live with us in Chicago. I want to take care of you." Margaret's fingers tightened around the receiver. For a moment she could not speak. Her entire body felt lighter. After Samuel's death, she had learned not to expect too much from anyone. But this sounded like love returning. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. "Of course, Mom, it's time." She wiped at her eyes, embarrassed by tears though no one could see them. That night, she sat at her small kitchen table long after sunset looking around the room. At the cabinets Samuel had repaired. At the dent in the wall from when David was 8 and had thrown a baseball indoors despite warnings. At the worn groove in the floor where Samuel's rocking chair once stood. The house was not just wood and nails. It was memory. But she believed family mattered more than walls. Over the next weeks, Margaret met with a local real estate agent. Mr. Harold Pierce, a middle-aged white man with thinning blonde hair and a polite, businesslike demeanor. He had known the Johnson family for years and treated Margaret with respectful courtesy. "You sure about this, Miss Johnson?" he asked gently. "My son wants me close," she replied, smiling softly. "That's enough." The house sold quickly. The market favored buyers from the city looking for Southern charm. Margaret signed the papers with steady hands. When the funds cleared, she called David. "I'll wire the money to you," she said. "You'll need it for arrangements." There was a brief pause on the line. "That would help, Mom. We'll get everything ready." She did not question it. Trust had never required proof. Margaret began packing slowly. She did not own much: some folded dresses, old photo albums, Samuel's watch, her Bible, and the small radio. She left the heavier furniture behind. The lavender vines would bloom without her. On her final evening in the house, she sat on the porch as the Georgia sky turned amber and gold. Fireflies blinked across the yard. She whispered a quiet goodbye, not to the house, but to the life she had known. In Chicago, David transferred the wired funds into an account to stabilize his failing investment obligations. Linda reviewed the numbers and nodded. "This gives us breathing room," she said. David stared at the confirmation receipt on his phone. For a moment, something uneasy flickered across his face, but he silenced it. In Georgia, Margaret closed the front door one last time. She believed she was walking toward her son. She did not know she was walking away from everything. Margaret Johnson left Georgia before sunrise. the sky still tinted in soft blue-gray as if the world itself had not fully awakened. A neighbor drove her to the small regional airport 2 towns over. She carried one faded navy suitcase with a broken zipper tied shut using a piece of string. Inside were 3 modest dresses, a cardigan, her Bible, Samuel's watch wrapped carefully in a handkerchief, and the small radio she refused to leave behind. In her coat pocket, she kept a thin envelope with a few folded dollar bills and loose change. She had wired everything else to David. She believed she would not need more. At the departure gate, she sat quietly among hurried travelers in pressed suits and young families juggling restless children. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, her posture straight despite the long journey ahead. A young airline attendant named Claire Benton approached her before boarding. Claire was in her early 30s, petite with light freckles and auburn hair tucked into a tight bun beneath her navy cap. She had kind hazel eyes that softened whenever she noticed someone traveling alone. Claire's father had passed away the previous winter, and since then she found herself especially attentive to elderly passengers. "Are you flying alone today, ma'am?" she asked gently. Margaret smiled. "Yes, dear. My son will meet me when I land." Claire helped her down the narrow aisle and ensured her suitcase was safely stowed. It was a small gesture, but Margaret felt reassured. The flight to Chicago was longer than she expected. Turbulence rattled the cabin once, and Margaret gripped the armrest but did not complain. She looked out the window at the thick blanket of clouds below and whispered a quiet prayer for new beginnings. She imagined David waiting with open arms, imagined seeing the skyline she had only glimpsed on television. When the plane descended through the clouds into Chicago, the view startled her. The sky was heavy and gray, and the wind rocked the aircraft slightly as it approached O'Hare International Airport. The buildings stretched endlessly in every direction. There was no lavender here, no soft cicada hum, only concrete, steel, and movement. Inside the airport, the air felt colder, sharper. Travelers hurried past her in long strides, their coats wrapped tight against the wind. Margaret moved slowly, following signs toward baggage claim. She kept glancing toward the exit doors, expecting at any moment to see David's tall figure searching for her. She waited near a column beside the sliding glass doors. Minutes passed, then an hour. She shifted her weight carefully from one foot to the other, her cane steady against the polished floor. She dialed David's number. It rang once, then straight to voicemail. She waited longer. A security guard named Officer Thomas Green eventually approached her. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with pale skin and a thick brown mustache that twitched when he frowned. His posture was rigid, trained by years of airport duty. "Ma'am, you need assistance?" he asked, not unkindly but with professional detachment. Margaret explained softly that her son was coming. Thomas checked his watch. "It's been nearly 2 hours." She nodded. "He must be delayed." Another call. Voicemail. Her voice trembled slightly on the third attempt. As evening deepened, the automatic doors continued to open and close, releasing gusts of frigid wind inside. Her thin coat, suitable for Georgia's mild winters, was no match for Chicago's early chill. Back in the city, David sat in a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown traffic. He stared at his phone as it vibrated repeatedly with missed calls. Linda sat beside him, arms crossed neatly, lips pressed thin. "You can't answer," she whispered. "If she comes here now, everything collapses. We aren't ready." David exhaled slowly. "Just for tonight," he said. He turned the phone face down. At O'Hare, Margaret's hope slowly shifted into confusion. She did not allow panic to take hold. She had survived much harder days in her life. When it became clear that no one was coming, she approached a taxi stand outside the terminal. The wind cut sharply across her face, stealing her breath. A taxi driver named Raj Patel stepped out to help her into the back seat. Raj was a lean man in his early 40s with dark hair streaked prematurely with gray. His warm brown eyes carried the quiet resilience of someone who had immigrated to America 20 years earlier with little more than ambition. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked. Margaret handed him a small piece of paper with David's address written carefully in blue ink. Raj drove through long stretches of highway lit by cold street lamps. Margaret watched the city blur past her window. Endless buildings, flashing lights, unfamiliar streets. She had imagined Chicago would feel exciting. Instead, it felt enormous and indifferent. They arrived at a mid-rise apartment complex on the north side. The building was modern, brick-lined, with balconies stacked neatly above one another. Raj helped her out and carried her suitcase to the front entrance. Margaret paid him carefully, counting each bill twice. Raj hesitated. "You sure someone's home?" he asked gently. "Yes," she said. "My son lives here." Inside the lobby, the warmth hit her immediately. Polished tile floors reflected overhead lighting. A faint scent of cleaning solution lingered in the air. Behind the front desk sat Mrs. Elena Alvarez. Mrs. Alvarez was in her late 50s with medium brown skin and shoulder-length black hair streaked lightly with silver. Her posture was upright, but relaxed. Years earlier, she had emigrated from Mexico with her husband and built a stable life managing residential properties. After her husband's passing from heart disease, she became even more disciplined about rules and contracts. Structure gave her security, but beneath her practical exterior, she carried a softness for people who reminded her of her own mother. "Yes?" she asked, looking up from paperwork. Margaret gave David's apartment number. Mrs. Alvarez's expression shifted subtly. "That unit was rented 2 months ago," she said carefully. Margaret blinked. "No, my son lives there." Mrs. Alvarez checked her computer again. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The previous tenant moved out months ago." Margaret felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. She gripped her cane tighter. "Perhaps there's been a mistake," she whispered. Mrs. Alvarez studied her for a moment, taking in the thin coat, the trembling fingers, the single suitcase. Compassion flickered across her face. She stood and walked around the desk. "Come sit," she said gently. She led Margaret to a small office chair and brought her a cup of warm water from the staff kitchenette. "Are you able to reach your son?" she asked. Margaret tried again. Voicemail. The silence felt heavier this time. Mrs. Alvarez's voice softened. "I wish I could let you stay in an empty unit tonight, but I legally cannot. Corporate policy. Cameras everywhere." She hesitated. "There's a train station 2 blocks down. It stays open late. It's warm inside." Margaret nodded slowly. She had never imagined needing directions to shelter in a city where her son supposedly lived. Raj, the taxi driver who had not yet driven away, noticed through the lobby glass that something was wrong. He stepped back inside briefly. "Everything okay?" Mrs. Alvarez shook her head slightly. Raj pressed a folded $20 bill into Margaret's hand. "For food," he said simply. No argument. She tried to refuse, but he insisted. "My mother lives far away too," he added quietly. Margaret thanked him, her voice barely audible. The walk to the train station felt longer than 2 blocks. The wind whipped around corners mercilessly. Neon signs flickered above storefronts already closing for the night. Margaret's cane tapped steadily against the sidewalk as she moved. The station was vast compared to her small-town depot back home. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Metal benches lined the walls. A few travelers waited for late trains, heads bowed over phones. A janitor pushed a cleaning cart slowly across the tiled floor. His name badge read, Marcus Lee. He was a tall black man in his early 30s with a shaved head and calm, observant eyes. He had once studied architecture but dropped out when his father fell ill and bills mounted. He noticed Margaret immediately. "You need help finding a train?" he asked gently. "No, thank you," she replied. "I'm just resting." Marcus sensed more but did not press. He finished mopping near her bench and quietly adjusted a nearby heater vent to blow warmer air in her direction. It was a silent kindness. Margaret sat on the hard metal bench, her suitcase resting upright beside her. She folded her hands over her cane. The envelope of remaining cash felt thin in her pocket. She stared ahead at nothing in particular. For the first time that day, doubt seeped in. Not anger, not yet. Just confusion. She dialed David again. Voicemail. She did not cry. Instead, she straightened her back and inhaled slowly. She had endured worse storms in her life than a cold Chicago evening. But as the hours passed and the station quieted, reality settled gently but unmistakably over her shoulders. No one was coming. Margaret Johnson's first night in Chicago would not be in her son's home. It would be on a metal bench beneath fluorescent lights, in a city that did not know her name. And still, she waited a little longer, just in case. Chicago winter did not arrive gently. It descended like a verdict. The wind sliced through coats, tunneled between buildings, and turned breath into visible clouds that vanished as quickly as they formed. The sky remained a pale, exhausted gray for days at a time, and the lake carried a cold that felt older than the city itself. Margaret Johnson woke stiff on the metal bench in the train station, her neck aching from the unfamiliar angle of sleep. The fluorescent lights had never turned off. The world had simply shifted around her while she remained still. For a few seconds, she forgot where she was, then the ceiling, the echo of footsteps, the distant rumble of arriving trains reminded her. She adjusted her thin coat and stood slowly, leaning on her cane. Her suitcase felt heavier now, not because of its contents, but because it was everything she owned. Marcus Lee, the janitor from the night before, noticed her again as he replaced a trash liner near the platform entrance. In the bright morning light, he looked younger than she first thought. 32 at most. His build was lean but strong from years of manual labor, his movements deliberate. There was a quiet watchfulness in him. Growing up on Chicago's South Side, he had learned early that survival required awareness. "Morning, ma'am," he said gently. "You find your ride?" Margaret hesitated only a second. "Not yet." Marcus nodded slowly. He had heard that tone before, from veterans who slept in the station between paychecks, from women who carried more than luggage in their silence. "There's a diner 3 blocks west," he offered. "They toss out leftovers near closing. Owner's decent." She thanked him. Pride did not disappear with age. It simply became quieter. But hunger did not wait for pride to adjust. By late afternoon, the temperature had dropped again. Margaret followed Marcus's directions carefully. The diner's neon sign flickered. Harrison's Grill. Inside, the smell of fried onions and coffee filled the air. She did not enter at first. She waited outside, leaning against the brick wall until closing time. The owner, Harold Harrison, was a heavy-set white man in his early 60s with thinning blonde hair and thick glasses that slid constantly down his nose. Years ago, his wife had died of cancer, and since then he ran the diner alone with mechanical consistency. He noticed Margaret standing outside through the window reflection. When he stepped out to lock up, she spoke softly. "Sir, if there's anything left you won't be using." Harold studied her carefully. He had seen many people ask for food, but something about her posture, upright despite exhaustion, made him pause. Without a word, he returned inside and came back with a small paper bag. "End-of-day sandwiches," he said gruffly. "Still good." He handed them to her without meeting her eyes, as if pretending it was routine. She thanked him with quiet dignity. That became her pattern. Each evening she waited until restaurants closed. Some workers ignored her completely. A few rolled their eyes. One young server laughed once and muttered, "Shouldn't she be in a nursing home?" Margaret heard it, but did not respond. During the day, she gravitated toward a grocery store on Clark Street. It was large, brightly lit, always busy. She positioned herself near the entrance as closing hour approached. She did not beg loudly. She simply sat on a low concrete ledge with her cane resting against her knee. Some shoppers avoided eye contact. Some gave her $1 without looking at her face. Others stared openly, suspicion sharp in their expressions. The wind burned her cheeks. Snow flurries began one evening, light at first, then steady. Her Georgia coat was no defense against Chicago's January. She counted her remaining cash carefully. Raj's $20 had helped stretch the first few days, but expenses moved quickly. Public restrooms that required coins, occasional coffee to warm her hands. Returning to Georgia was impossible. The house was gone, the money was gone, pride kept her from calling anyone else for help. Across the street from the grocery store stood a small law office with frosted glass windows. Ethan Miller worked there as a part-time assistant while finishing his final semester of law school at Northwestern. Ethan was 27, tall and slightly awkward in posture as if he had grown too quickly in adolescence and never quite adjusted. His sandy brown hair fell messily over his forehead when he forgot to style it, and his blue eyes carried a restless intensity. He came from a modest, middle-class family in Ohio. His mother was a public school teacher, his father a postal worker. Growing up, Ethan had watched his grandmother struggle after being denied proper medical care due to insurance technicalities. That experience carved into him a quiet anger toward systems that failed the vulnerable. Each evening, Ethan stopped at the grocery store before heading home to his small apartment. The first time he noticed Margaret, he assumed she was waiting for someone. The second time, he saw her accepting a crumpled dollar from a passerby. The third time, snow clung lightly to her coat. He slowed his steps. He told himself he would speak to her. But something held him back. Uncertainty, fear of intruding, perhaps even guilt at not knowing what to say. Instead, he purchased an extra loaf of bread and left it quietly beside her one night, pretending to check his phone. She looked up, surprised. "Thank you," she said. He nodded quickly and walked away before conversation could begin. Ethan lay awake that night, unsettled by how easily he had retreated. Back in Georgia, Dorothy Fields stood on her front porch, staring at Margaret's empty house. Dorothy was 78, a stout black woman with tightly coiled gray hair and a voice that carried easily across yards. She had been Margaret's neighbor for over 30 years. Widowed like Margaret, she had grown used to sharing afternoon tea and trading stories about old times. Dorothy frowned at the "for sale" sign that had recently been removed. She had tried calling Margaret several times, but reached a disconnected tone. That was unlike her. Margaret never disappeared without notice. Dorothy dialed David's old number, the one she had written down years ago. It rang without answer. A quiet unease began forming in her chest. In Chicago, winter deepened. Margaret's hands trembled more often now, not from fear, but from cold. She learned which buildings kept doors unlocked during business hours. She learned the schedule of security patrols. She learned how to make herself smaller on public benches. One afternoon, a teenage boy named Caleb Turner approached her while waiting for his mother to exit the store. Caleb was 15, tall and lanky with curly black hair that refused to stay flat under his knit cap. His face still carried the softness of youth. He watched Margaret for a long moment before offering her a small pack of crackers. "My grandma lives in Alabama," he said shyly. "You remind me of her." Margaret smiled faintly. "Tell her you called," she replied gently. Not everyone was kind. A middle-aged woman with sharp red lipstick once stopped in front of Margaret and said loudly, "There are shelters for people like you." The phrase lingered in the air. People like you. Margaret met her gaze calmly, but said nothing. That night, as snow collected along the sidewalks, Ethan finally forced himself to stop properly. "Ma'am," he began awkwardly, hands shoved in his coat pockets. "Do you need help finding somewhere warmer?" Margaret studied him carefully. Up close, she could see sincerity beneath his nervousness. "I'm managing," she replied softly. "My name's Ethan," he said. "I work across the street." He gestured toward the law office. "If you ever need legal advice or something." She almost laughed at that. Legal advice felt distant from hunger, but she appreciated the offer. "Thank you, Ethan." They did not speak long. The wind discouraged lingering conversation. As weeks passed, Margaret's presence became part of the grocery store's nightly rhythm. Some regular shoppers grew used to her silhouette against the store's glass doors. Others still avoided looking directly at her. Inside the law office, Ethan found himself distracted. He researched city ordinances about loitering and vagrancy during lunch breaks. He told himself it was academic curiosity, but in truth he was preparing, though he did not yet know for what. Back in Georgia, Dorothy made a decision. She contacted Mr. Harold Pierce, the real estate agent who had handled Margaret's home sale. "Did she leave a forwarding address?" Dorothy asked firmly. Harold hesitated, but eventually confirmed the funds had been wired to Chicago at David's request. Dorothy's unease hardened into concern. In Chicago, Margaret counted the coins in her pocket again one evening. The metal felt thin and cold against her fingers. Snow fell heavier now. Her breath came out in short white bursts. She looked up at the illuminated grocery store sign. The city moved around her, cars honking, doors sliding open and closed, boots crunching against snow. She had become part of the background. Some people glanced, some frowned, some pretended not to see her at all. Margaret Johnson, who once owned a house wrapped in lavender and laughter, now survived on leftover sandwiches and scattered kindness. And the city, vast and restless, did not see her. The wind that evening was sharper than usual, slicing through Clark Street with a bitterness that made even seasoned Chicago residents pull their collars tighter. Snow from earlier in the week had hardened into gray ridges along the sidewalk, pushed aside by boots and tires. The grocery store lights glowed warmly against the early darkness, promising comfort that did not extend beyond its sliding glass doors. Margaret Johnson sat in her usual place near the concrete ledge by the entrance. Her coat, now visibly thinner from weeks of wear, hung loosely around her narrow shoulders. Her gloved hands, mismatched and worn, rested over the handle of her cane. She had learned to conserve movement, to preserve warmth by staying still. The cold had begun to creep into her bones in ways she could not ignore. A few feet away stood another homeless man Margaret had seen occasionally but never spoken to. His name, she would later learn, was Leonard "Lenny" Brooks. Lenny was in his late 50s with pale, weathered skin and a scruffy gray beard that covered most of his jawline. His hair was long, greasy, and tied loosely at the back. He wore layers of jackets too large for his thin frame, and his movements were jittery, restless, reactive. Years of addiction had left their mark on him, though recently he had been trying to stay sober. His eyes darted frequently toward security cameras, always alert. That evening, Lenny emerged from the store's automatic doors, clutching a small plastic bag marked with a bright yellow "Discount Day-Old Bread" sticker. He moved quickly, head low. Behind him, a store employee shouted something indistinct. Lenny's panic sharpened instantly. He dropped the bag near the entrance and hurried off toward the alley, disappearing between parked cars. Margaret watched the bag land at her feet. For a moment, she did not move. She had learned caution. Then she looked toward the store doors. No one stepped forward to claim it. The bread was clearly discounted, marked down, perhaps unsellable by morning. She thought perhaps she could take it inside and offer the few coins she had left, or ask if she might purchase it for less. She bent slowly, joints stiff, and lifted the bag carefully with both hands. At that exact moment, the store's evening security guard stepped outside. His name was Officer Ryan Calloway. He was 35, tall and broad-shouldered with cropped blonde hair and a square jaw. His pale blue eyes carried the firm detachment of someone trained to see threat before vulnerability. Ryan had served 6 years in the military before transitioning into private security. Experience had hardened his instincts. His younger brother had once been arrested after stealing food during a difficult period, and Ryan believed strict enforcement prevented bigger problems later. In his mind, rules maintained order. From his vantage point, he saw only one thing: an elderly woman lifting unpaid merchandise near the entrance. "Ma'am!" he called sharply. Margaret straightened slowly, startled. "That item wasn't purchased," Ryan said, stepping forward. "I was just going to ask," she began softly. "Put it down." The tone left no space for explanation. She obeyed immediately, placing the bag back onto the concrete ledge. A small crowd of shoppers exiting the store slowed, curiosity flickering in their expressions. "I didn't take it," Margaret tried again, voice trembling slightly but controlled. "A man dropped it." Ryan's jaw tightened. "You were holding it." He spoke into his radio. Inside the store, the assistant manager, a woman named Karen Whitfield, emerged. Karen was in her early 40s, medium height, with short dark hair and rectangular glasses perched precisely on her nose. She valued efficiency and disliked confrontation. Years of managing inventory shrinkage had made her cautious. She glanced between Ryan and Margaret, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to contradict security protocol publicly. "We can't ignore theft," Karen said quietly to Ryan. Margaret stood very still. The wind pressed against her back. The plastic bag rustled at her feet. Ryan called local police. Across the street, Ethan Miller had just exited the law office. He had stayed late reviewing tenant rights paperwork for a separate case. As he locked the office door, he noticed flashing lights reflecting faintly against the grocery store windows. His stomach tightened. He crossed the street quickly. 2 officers arrived within minutes. One of them, Officer Melissa Grant, stepped out of the patrol car first. Melissa was 29, tall and athletic, with tightly braided dark hair pulled into a bun beneath her cap. Her skin was warm brown, her expression controlled but observant. She had grown up in a working-class neighborhood on the west side and joined the police force believing she could balance enforcement with empathy. Beside her was Officer Daniel Hargrove, mid-40s, heavier build, thinning hair, and a weary expression shaped by 2 decades on the force. Daniel valued procedure over nuance. Ryan summarized the situation briskly. Witnessed her lifting unpaid merchandise. Melissa turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, did you take this bread?" Margaret met her gaze steadily. "No, it was dropped. I intended to ask if I could buy it." Daniel exhaled audibly. "Ma'am, store policy says you can't remove unpaid items from the premises." "I didn't remove it," Margaret replied softly. The distinction did not seem to matter. A few bystanders whispered. One recorded on a phone. Ethan stepped closer. "Officers," he said carefully, trying to keep his tone respectful. "I saw her here earlier. She's been sitting outside most evenings. I don't think she intended to steal." Daniel glanced at him. "You her attorney?" "No." Melissa studied Margaret again. She noticed the trembling fingers, the thin coat, the unmistakable exhaustion in her eyes. But policy pressed heavily on moments like this. "Ma'am, we'll need you to come with us to sort this out." Margaret did not resist. Ryan retrieved the bag of bread as evidence. As Melissa gently guided Margaret toward the patrol car, Ethan felt a surge of frustration he had not anticipated. It felt disproportionate. It felt unnecessary. The cold air bit sharply as the car door closed. Inside the squad car, Margaret sat upright, hands folded in her lap. She did not cry. She did not argue. She had once lived in a time when accusations came more easily than justice. The memory of segregation-era suspicion had never fully faded. Tonight felt painfully familiar. At the precinct station, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The walls were pale beige, institutional and indifferent. Margaret was processed quietly. Fingerprints. Basic identification questions. The orange holding uniform they handed her swallowed her slight frame. Officer Melissa Grant lingered a moment longer than required before stepping away. In the waiting area, Ethan paced. He had followed the patrol car on foot part of the way before catching a rideshare to the station. He felt anger, but also guilt for not stepping in sooner, for waiting weeks to truly engage. A middle-aged receptionist behind the desk, Ms. Sandra Lopez, a woman with short salt-and-pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor softened by kind eyes, noticed his agitation. "You family?" she asked. "No," Ethan admitted, "but I want to help." Sandra nodded faintly. "Then get her representation." The phrase settled in his mind. Later that evening, Ethan returned to the law office and searched for contact information for the city's legal aid society. He drafted an email requesting temporary internship status, citing immediate need in a minor theft case involving a 90-year-old homeless woman. He did not overstate. He simply described what he saw. Meanwhile, in a high-rise apartment across the city, David Johnson scrolled absent-mindedly through local news on his tablet while Linda prepared dinner in their sleek kitchen. A small headline caught his attention. "Elderly woman arrested for shoplifting discounted bread." He clicked briefly. The article included a grainy photo taken from a distance, an elderly black woman in a thin coat standing beside a patrol car. David frowned for a second, then scrolled past. It did not register. The image was too small. The context too inconvenient. At the station, Margaret sat quietly on a hard bench in the holding area. The orange fabric felt foreign against her skin. She clasped Samuel's watch in her hand, the only personal item they had allowed her to keep temporarily before processing. She had not stolen. She had not shouted. She had simply bent to lift bread. Outside, snow began falling again, light, steady, indifferent. Margaret Johnson, once the owner of a lavender-lined porch in Georgia, now wore a detainee's uniform under buzzing lights. And the charge, written beside her name, read, "Petty theft." The courtroom on the third floor of the municipal building was smaller than most people imagined when they heard the word justice. The walls were paneled in dark wood, worn smooth by decades of hearings. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, and the air carried the sterile scent of paper and old carpet. Outside, Chicago's winter wind rattled against the narrow windows, but inside everything felt still, measured, procedural. Margaret Johnson sat at the defense table in a borrowed gray cardigan provided by a volunteer from the station. The orange holding uniform had been replaced with simple civilian clothing arranged hastily that morning. Her silver hair was once again pinned neatly into a bun. Despite the exhaustion lining her face, she carried herself upright, hands folded gently over one another. Beside her sat a young attorney from the Legal Aid Society, Angela Morris. Angela was 42, a black woman of medium height with a slim professional build and sharp, intelligent dark eyes. Her hair was pulled back into a low bun, and she wore a tailored navy suit that emphasized composure rather than intimidation. Angela had built her career representing tenants facing eviction and seniors navigating bureaucratic neglect. Years earlier, she had watched her own grandmother nearly lose her apartment due to an administrative oversight. That memory had shaped her patience and her quiet determination. Ethan Miller sat 2 rows behind them, a legal pad resting on his knee. His sandy hair was less carefully arranged than usual, and dark circles framed his blue eyes from lack of sleep. He had officially secured temporary student intern status with Angela's office that morning, citing Margaret's case as his reason. This was the first hearing he would observe so closely. At precisely 9 o'clock, the courtroom door opened, and Judge Rebecca Thompson entered. Judge Thompson was 60 years old, tall and slender with straight silver hair cut to shoulder length. Her pale skin bore subtle age lines, but her gray-blue eyes were alert and penetrating. She wore the traditional black judicial robe with quiet authority. Throughout her 25 years on the bench, She had built a reputation for strict adherence to law, balanced by a deep respect for fairness. Early in her career, she had faced criticism for ruling against discriminatory housing practices. Since then, she had carried herself with measured neutrality that concealed deep moral conviction. "Be seated," she said calmly. The prosecutor, a man named Richard Hale, rose first. Richard was 51, broad-shouldered with a square face and neatly combed dark hair streaked with gray at the temples. His tailored charcoal suit fit impeccably. He valued efficiency and clear outcomes. Petty theft cases rarely lingered in his courtroom strategy. "Your Honor," he began. The defendant was observed holding unpaid merchandise outside the premises of Clark Street Market. Security footage confirms possession. Angela stood slowly. "Your Honor, we do not dispute that Ms. Johnson physically held the item. However, context matters." Judge Thompson turned her gaze toward Margaret. "Ms. Johnson," she said evenly, "would you like to explain the events in your own words?" Margaret rose carefully with Angela's assistance. The courtroom felt suddenly larger. A few local reporters sat along the back wall, not expecting anything remarkable from the morning docket. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Margaret did not look at the prosecutor. She looked at the judge. "I did not steal," she said softly. Her voice was thin but steady. "A man dropped the bread. I thought perhaps I could ask to buy it." She paused. Then, unexpectedly, she continued. "I am not from here," she said. "I lived in Georgia all my life, in a small house my husband built. We raised our son there." The courtroom shifted slightly. Papers stilled. Pens paused. Margaret did not embellish. She did not dramatize. She spoke plainly. "I sold that house," she said, hands trembling faintly now. "My son asked me to come live with him here. I wired him the money so he could make arrangements." Angela did not interrupt. Margaret's eyes glistened, but she did not cry openly. "He told me to fly. He said he would meet me. He did not come." A quiet ripple passed through the gallery. Judge Thompson's expression changed subtly, not from sympathy alone, but from recognition of gravity beyond the initial charge. Margaret continued. "I tried to find him. The address was not his. I have not been able to reach him. I did not steal bread. I was hungry." Silence settled heavily over the room. Even Richard Hale looked down at his folder. Judge Thompson leaned back slightly in her chair, studying Margaret. "Ms. Johnson," she said carefully, "are you currently without permanent housing?" "Yes, Your Honor." Angela stepped forward. "We can provide documentation that Ms. Johnson sold her home in Georgia and transferred funds to her son prior to relocating." Richard cleared his throat but did not object. Judge Thompson removed her glasses briefly, pressing them lightly against her lips as she considered. In the second row, Ethan felt something shift inside him. This was no longer about bread. The judge spoke again. "The charge before this court is petty theft. However, the facts presented indicate extenuating circumstances. The evidence does not establish intent beyond reasonable doubt." She paused. "Charges are dismissed." A soft murmur rose from the back of the courtroom. Margaret exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding her breath since the night of her arrest. But Judge Thompson was not finished. She leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Johnson, I encourage you to meet with legal aid services regarding potential financial exploitation. If what you have described is accurate, there may be further legal considerations." Her tone remained neutral, but the implication was clear. Margaret nodded gently. "Thank you, Your Honor." As the hearing concluded, reporters who had nearly skipped the morning docket began scribbling notes quickly. One of them, a young journalist named Claire Bennett, approached the aisle cautiously. Claire was 34, tall and slim, with shoulder-length brown hair tucked behind one ear. Her gray-blue eyes were sharp with curiosity but not cruelty. She had built her career writing about systemic inequities, stories that revealed overlooked truths. "Ma'am," she asked Margaret gently, "would you be willing to share more of your story?" Angela intervened politely. "Not today." Outside the courthouse, the wind had not softened. Margaret stepped onto the stone steps, shielding her eyes from the brightness reflecting off snow. Ethan followed, heart still pounding from what he had witnessed. "Miss Johnson," he said hesitantly, I'm glad you spoke." She looked at him calmly. "Truth is lighter than lies," she replied. That afternoon, Ethan returned to his small apartment, a modest one-bedroom with mismatched furniture and stacks of law textbooks lining the walls. He sat at his kitchen table, laptop open. He stared at the blank screen for several minutes. Then he began typing. He did not accuse David by name. He did not condemn the store. He simply told what he had seen. He described a 90-year-old woman standing in court, speaking about a house in Georgia wrapped in lavender. He described a flight without welcome. He described hunger mistaken for crime. He ended the post with a simple sentence: "We must decide what kind of city we want to be." He hesitated before pressing publish. Then he did. Within hours, shares multiplied. Strangers commented with outrage and compassion in equal measure. Community groups requested more information. Local activists tagged city council members. The article Claire Bennett wrote that evening echoed similar themes and amplified the narrative. By nightfall, Margaret's name was circulating quietly beyond the courtroom. In a high-rise apartment downtown, David Johnson sat scrolling through his phone once more. A shared post caught his eye. 90-year-old woman abandoned after selling home. He frowned, pausing slightly longer than before. But he did not yet click. Across the city, snow continued to fall lightly, dusting sidewalks and rooftops. Margaret Johnson had entered the courtroom accused of stealing bread. She left, having told the truth. And for the first time since arriving in Chicago, someone had truly listened. "Bao Kao Trung Lap, Tieng Viet. Kong Trung Lap Noi Dung Voi Kas Chapter Truok. Noi Dung Fat Trien Chi Tiet Fien To. Nan Wat Tham Fan Rebecca Thompson. Luatsu Angela Morris. Kong Tu Vien Richard Hale. Van Ha Bao Claire Bennett. Kong Lan Sang Chapter Sao. Tom Tat Ngan Gon Chapter Nam. Margaret Ra Toa Truok Tham Fan Rebecca Thompson. Ba Kong Bien Min Ma Ketuan Bo Kau Chuyen Tu Georgia Jen Chuyen Bay Kong Nanguoi John. Tam Fan Hanra Hoan Kan Jack Biet Va Bach Bo Kau Buk. Ethan Viet Bai Chese Trong Lap Ve Kau Chuyen Va Bai Viet Han Chong Lan Truyen. By the following morning, Chicago had awakened to more than just another winter day. The photograph, grainy but unmistakable, circulated across social media platforms at a speed no one involved had anticipated. It showed Margaret Johnson standing beside a patrol car in an oversized orange detainee uniform, her silver hair stark against the fluorescent glare. Her posture was straight, her expression neither defiant nor broken, simply tired. The image carried a caption that varied depending on who shared it. 90-year-old woman, arrested for bread. Elderly, homeless woman abandoned by family. Justice or failure? Outrage moved faster than context. Online comments flooded in. Some furious, some compassionate, some suspicious. Community organizers reposted Ethan Miller's account of the courtroom hearing. His words were calm, restrained, but powerful. He had not accused anyone directly, yet the narrative itself was indictment enough. Ethan woke to hundreds of notifications vibrating against his nightstand. He blinked at the screen in disbelief. He was not accustomed to attention. He was 27, still a student, more comfortable behind legal textbooks than camera lenses. His sandy brown hair stuck up awkwardly as he ran a hand through it, reading comment after comment. A message arrived from a local television station requesting an interview. By afternoon, Channel 7 news vans were parked outside the Legal Aid Society office. The reporter assigned to the story was Claire Bennett, the same journalist who had attended the hearing. Claire stood poised in front of the courthouse steps, a navy coat buttoned tightly against the cold. Her brown hair moved slightly in the wind as the cameraman adjusted focus. "Chicago is responding tonight to the story of Margaret Johnson," she began, voice steady and clear. A 90-year-old woman whose court testimony revealed a deeper issue than petty theft. Inside the studio, later that evening, Ethan sat across from Claire under bright lights. He looked slightly uncomfortable in his borrowed blazer, shoulders stiff. "I didn't expect this," he admitted. "I only wrote what I witnessed." Claire leaned forward. "Do you believe this case reflects something larger?" Ethan hesitated, choosing words carefully. "I believe vulnerability is often misunderstood. Age, poverty, race. When those intersect, people are seen before they are heard." The clip aired that night. Judge Rebecca Thompson also received a request for comment. She declined to discuss specifics of the case but agreed to a brief statement recorded in her chambers. The camera framed her from the shoulders up, robe visible, silver hair neatly arranged. "Our justice system must balance law with humanity," she said calmly. "While I cannot comment on individual proceedings, I will say this. Compassion is not weakness. It is responsibility." The phrase echoed across headlines. Meanwhile, donation pages began appearing online. A local church on the South Side launched a small fundraiser to secure temporary housing for Margaret. Within hours, contributions exceeded expectations. $5 here, $50 there, $1,000 from an anonymous donor. A community housing advocate named Samuel Ortiz contacted Angela Morris. Samuel was in his late 40s, tall and lean with olive-toned skin and neatly trimmed black hair. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and spoke with measured intensity. Years earlier, he had nearly lost his own childhood home to foreclosure. Since then, he dedicated himself to preventing others from facing similar displacement. "We have a transitional unit available," he told Angela. "Short-term, safe." Margaret herself did not understand the magnitude of attention gathering around her name. She sat quietly in a small consultation room at Legal Aid while Angela explained that people wanted to help. "I don't want trouble," Margaret said softly. Angela smiled gently. "You didn't create trouble. You revealed it." Across the city, David Johnson stood frozen in his high-rise living room, tablet trembling slightly in his hands. The headline this time included a clearer image. Margaret's face more visible beneath the harsh lighting of the arrest photo. He leaned closer. His breath caught. The silver bun, the familiar slope of her cheek, the cane. "No," he whispered. Linda entered from the kitchen, her expression already tense. "What is it?" He turned the screen toward her. For a moment she said nothing. Then her composure cracked. "That can't be—" "It is," David replied. The article detailed Margaret's testimony in court. The house in Georgia, the wire transfer, the abandoned airport arrival. It did not name David directly, but the implications were unmistakable. Linda paced across the marble floor, her heels clicking sharply. "People are going to look into this," she said, voice rising. "They'll trace the property records." David felt something unfamiliar press against his chest, shame layered with fear. He had justified his actions as temporary, strategic. He had told himself he would fix things once finances stabilized. He had not expected exposure. Online, users began asking, who was the son? Where did the house money go? Real estate records were public. It would not take long. Back in Georgia, Dorothy Fields sat at her small kitchen table, reading the news article on her aging desktop computer. Her thick glasses rested low on her nose as she leaned closer to the screen. "That's Margaret," she said aloud, voice trembling. The image pierced her. She recognized the cardigan, the bun, even the slight tilt of Margaret's chin when facing authority. Dorothy was not technologically fluent, but indignation sharpened her clarity. She dialed the newsroom number listed at the bottom of the article. After several transfers, she reached Claire Bennett directly. "I know that woman," Dorothy said firmly. "She sold her house because her son told her to." Claire listened carefully, pen moving swiftly across her notepad. Dorothy explained the house in Georgia, the lavender vines, the sale, the wire transfer handled by the local agent, Harold Pierce. She did not exaggerate. She simply confirmed what Margaret had testified. The next broadcast included Dorothy's voice, recorded over the phone. "Margaret Johnson was not homeless in Georgia," she said. "She had a home. She gave it up because she trusted her son." The narrative shifted from isolated misfortune to possible exploitation. By evening, talk radio stations debated elder neglect. Community leaders posted calls for accountability. Hashtags trended locally. Linda stared at her phone as notification after notification appeared. Strangers were already speculating about their address. "We have to respond," she insisted. "We need a statement." David could not form one. He saw, in vivid clarity now, his mother standing alone at O'Hare Airport. He imagined her sitting on that train station bench. The mental image did not allow him comfort. At Legal Aid, Angela arranged for Margaret to move temporarily into the transitional housing unit Samuel Ortiz secured. It was modest but warm. A small studio apartment with clean white walls, a twin bed, and a kitchenette. Margaret stood quietly inside, absorbing the unfamiliar space. Outside, cameras waited. Ethan stood beside Angela as reporters gathered for brief comments. He felt overwhelmed, but grounded. "This story isn't about punishment," he said into a microphone. "It's about recognition. We failed to see someone who deserved to be seen." The statement circulated widely. In their apartment, Linda closed the curtains tightly as if fabric could block public scrutiny. "If they connect your name," she began. "They will," David interrupted quietly. He stared again at the image of his mother in orange. For the first time since that phone call in Georgia, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done. Margaret Johnson's story had left the courtroom and entered the city, and now the city was looking back. The Community Assistance Center stood on a quiet side street just beyond downtown Chicago, its red brick exterior modest but sturdy. A thin layer of snow still edged the sidewalks, though the sky that morning was clearer than it had been in weeks. Pale sunlight filtered through bare tree branches, softening the sharp lines of winter. Inside, Margaret Johnson sat near a window in the transitional housing facility arranged by Samuel Ortiz. The room was simple. White walls, a narrow bed, a small wooden table, but it was warm. She wore a borrowed wool cardigan donated by a church group, her silver hair pinned neatly as always. Her posture remained dignified, though fatigue had settled deeper into her bones over the past months. Samuel Ortiz stood in the hallway, speaking quietly with Angela Morris about next steps in the legal inquiry. He glanced toward Margaret occasionally, protective but respectful of her privacy. The front door opened. David Johnson stepped inside. He looked different from the sharply composed developer who once stood confidently in glass-walled offices. His tailored coat hung loosely now, unbuttoned, as if he had dressed without thinking. Dark circles lined his eyes. His neatly trimmed hair appeared slightly disheveled, and the confident set of his jaw had softened into uncertainty. Behind him, Linda Johnson paused briefly at the entrance. She wore a dark wool coat, her chestnut hair tied back tightly. The sharp composure that once defined her had been replaced by visible strain. The past week of public scrutiny had stripped away her certainty. Samuel approached them first. "She's inside," he said calmly, measuring David's expression carefully. David nodded without speaking. When he stepped into Margaret's room, time seemed to compress. Margaret looked up slowly. For a moment, neither moved. David took a few steps forward. His tall frame, once imposing with self-assurance, now seemed burdened. His eyes, brown and restless like his father's, filled quickly with tears he had not prepared for. "Mom," he whispered. Margaret did not rise immediately. She studied his face as though searching for the boy who once chased baseballs across the Georgia yard. Then David did something no one in the room expected. He fell to his knees. The sound of his coat brushing the floor was soft but unmistakable. "I was wrong," he said, voice breaking. "I was selfish. I convinced myself it was temporary, that I would fix everything before you noticed. I used the money to cover debts. I let you come here alone. I didn't answer your calls." He lowered his head, shoulders trembling. Linda remained near the doorway, hands clasped tightly. She did not kneel, but her face showed remorse sharpened by public exposure. "We thought we could manage it," she added quietly. "We were afraid of losing everything." Margaret listened without interrupting. The room was silent except for David's unsteady breathing. "I didn't think it would go this far," he continued. "I didn't think you would end up—" His voice failed him. Margaret's expression did not harden, nor did it soften immediately. She took a long, measured breath. For weeks, she had replayed the airport, the unanswered calls, the cold nights. She had felt confusion more than anger, sorrow more than rage. She stood slowly, leaning on her cane. David remained kneeling before her. After a long pause, Margaret lifted her thin hand and placed it gently on his bowed head. Her palm rested there, steady. "I don't need money," she said softly. "I needed my son." The words were not accusation. They were truth. David wept openly now, shoulders shaking. Years of ambition, pride, and justification collapsed in that moment. Angela Morris, who had quietly stepped into the doorway, turned away to give them privacy. Outside, reporters waited at a respectful distance, aware that reconciliation was unfolding inside, but restrained by Samuel Ortiz's firm boundary. In the days that followed, the consequences moved swiftly. Under growing public scrutiny and guided by Angela's legal counsel, David issued a formal public statement acknowledging financial exploitation and accepting responsibility. His name, once shielded, became publicly associated with the case. The real estate funds Margaret had wired were accounted for. David arranged full restitution, transferring every remaining dollar and supplementing the difference from his own assets. Legal documentation ensured that all funds were placed into an account solely in Margaret's name, with independent oversight. Linda participated in the process without protest. The past week had dismantled her illusions about control through calculation. She watched as lawyers drafted corrective agreements, her posture stiff but compliant. The high-rise apartment overlooking Lake Michigan was placed on the market. Neighbors who once admired their lifestyle now watched quietly as moving trucks arrived. With guidance from Samuel Ortiz and Angela Morris, Margaret reviewed options for permanent housing. She surprised many by declining offers to return to Georgia. "I buried my husband there," she said calmly. "But my son is here." David accompanied her to view a modest single-story home in a quiet suburb west of the city. The house had a small front porch and a narrow yard bordered by a white wooden fence in need of repair. It was not grand. It did not overlook a skyline. But it was solid. Margaret stood on the porch and closed her eyes briefly. "It's enough," she said. The purchase was completed with Margaret listed as sole owner. Linda signed the paperwork without hesitation. In the months that followed, quieter resolutions unfolded beyond headlines. Ethan Miller graduated from law school at the top of his class. At commencement, he wore his cap slightly crooked, his sandy hair resisting formal arrangement. His mother and father traveled from Ohio to watch him receive his diploma. He accepted a position at the Legal Aid Society full-time, dedicating himself to cases involving elder neglect and housing insecurity. Margaret attended his small celebration gathering, sitting near the front row, applauding softly, Judge Rebecca Thompson announced the launch of a pilot legal initiative within the city courts, an elder advocacy review program aimed at identifying signs of financial exploitation during minor criminal hearings. In interviews, she spoke carefully but clearly about systemic responsibility. Mrs. Elena Alvarez, the apartment manager who had once offered Margaret warm water but no shelter, sent a bouquet of white lilies to the new house on moving day. The card read simply, "For New Beginnings. E.A." Marcus Lee visited one afternoon carrying a small potted lavender plant. "Thought you might miss Georgia," he said shyly. Margaret smiled and placed it by the porch railing. On a mild spring afternoon, months later, the snow long gone, Margaret sat on the front porch of her new home. The sun rested warmly against her silver hair. Birds moved through the budding trees lining the street. David stood in the yard, sleeves rolled up, repairing the loose boards of the white fence. His movements were slower now, less hurried by ambition. Occasionally, he glanced toward the porch, as if confirming she was still there. Linda watered the small flower bed along the walkway, quieter than before, but present. Margaret watched them without bitterness. Forgiveness, she had learned long ago, was not forgetfulness. It was a decision to allow healing where harm once stood. The lavender plant near her feet stirred gently in the breeze. She closed her eyes briefly, breathing in. Not because she had forgotten, but because she had chosen to forgive. This story is not only about Margaret Johnson. It is about the quiet moments in our own lives when someone trusts us completely. It is about parents who give without contracts, who sacrifice without calculation, and who believe love will be returned simply because it was given first. In our daily lives, neglect rarely looks dramatic. It looks like unanswered calls. It looks like postponed visits. It looks like convenience placed above compassion. We live in a world that moves fast, where success is measured in numbers, property, and status. But this story reminds us that character is measured in how we treat the most vulnerable people around us. Margaret was not saved by anger. She was not restored by revenge. She was restored because truth was spoken, because people paid attention, and because accountability followed exposure. That is an important lesson. Compassion must be active. Justice must be visible, and silence, when faced with wrongdoing, only protects harm. In everyday life, we all stand at small crossroads. We can ignore the elderly woman sitting alone. We can scroll past uncomfortable stories. We can choose convenience over conscience. Or we can pause. We can ask questions. We can help. We can make one call to our parents today. We can check on a neighbor. We can choose honesty when dishonesty feels easier. There is also a lesson for families. Financial pressure does not justify moral failure. Hard times reveal character. They do not excuse betrayal. Love should never be converted into strategy. And yet, there is hope in this story. David fell, but he stood up. Accountability is not the end of a life. It is the beginning of rebuilding it correctly. Forgiveness does not erase consequences, but it opens the door for restoration. Let this story educate us gently. Let it remind us that elderly neglect is real, that racial bias still influences perception, that poverty is not a crime, that dignity does not expire with age. If this story moved you, do not keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs the reminder. Leave a comment about where you are watching from. Tell us what lesson stood out to you the most. If you believe that families can be restored and that justice begins with awareness, subscribe to this channel so more stories like this can reach more hearts. May God bless everyone watching. May He soften our hearts, strengthen our integrity, and protect our parents and grandparents wherever they are. If you believe in forgiveness, in accountability, and in second chances, type Amen in the comments.